Dear participants, welcome to the CIFRe webinar, Guidance for Application of the Circle Tool. My name is Jeuken. I'm a senior consultant and researcher at Deltares USA, based in Orlando. And today I have the pleasure to moderate and introduce you to this webinar. In today's webinar, we will focus on how the new Circle tool can help you in assessing impacts of floods on critical infrastructure. Failure of critical infrastructures such as electricity, roads, or drinking water supply can cause serious social disruptions. The causes and consequences of critical infrastructure failure are however difficult to assess and visualize. The new online Circle tool offers a method to do this. And the goal of this webinar is to present the Circle tool, share our experiences, and give guidance on how the tool can be used in workshops for other case studies. First, a few facts and figures about today's webinar. We received over 220 registrations from 24 different countries, and about 150 registrants are from the US, covering 30 different states. The participants reflect government agencies, NGOs, consultants, universities, and small businesses. Again, welcome to you all. Now let me first introduce you to the speakers of this webinar. Our first speaker is Andreas Burzel. He is a risk analyst on critical infrastructures and working in the Department of Flood Risk Management at Deltares in the Netherlands. Our second speaker is Jennifer Jurado, Director and Chief Resilience Officer of the Environmental Planning and Community Resilience Division of Broward County. Dr. Jeuken is Research Professor and Director of the Sea Level Solutions Center of the Florida International University, and he will be our third speaker. And then myself, I'm working in the field of climate adaptation and nature-based solutions for flood risk mitigation and resilience in coastal areas at Deltares USA. What can you expect for today? We will have 4 blocks in this webinar. I will first proceed with a short introduction, background, and the pilot with Broward County, and some reflection on recent events. Then Andreas will take over and he will guide us through the Circle workshops, how to organize these and how to use the Circle tool in these workshops. After that block, we will discuss some next steps and ongoing developments in the field of policy and decision making by Jennifer, and further developments by Obi. During the open discussion, our speakers are ready to answer your questions, but you can also submit your questions via text during the webinar. If you look on the right side of your screen, you see this taskbar, and there's a questions tab there. And in the question tab, you can type your questions during the webinar. At the end of each block and at the end of this webinar, there will be an opportunity to discuss these questions with the presenters. But first, some more background. Critical infrastructure is increasingly at risk. Over the past decades, the increasing frequency and intensity of extreme climatic events have impacted society in imaginable ways. Particularly, the interruptions of critical infrastructure such as electricity, communication, drinking water, and transportation systems lead to enormous, often long-lasting societal impacts, including fatalities and economic losses. Governmental and non-governmental agencies, infrastructure operators, and other stakeholders all face the challenge of protecting critical infrastructures from natural disaster. And each of them has a unique wealth of knowledge and experience. But often, individual organizations are unable to solve these challenges on their own because they are part of a complex network of networks. So a single sector approach is not sufficient because interdependencies and cascading effects are not considered. As a result of these challenges, assessment of critical infrastructures are not yet rooted in adaptation planning. This could lead to selections of measures that do not sufficiently reduce flood risk because they do not address the vulnerabilities of critical infrastructure. The three photos on the right show a good example of the interdependencies and cascading effects. During Hurricane Wilma in 2005, all access roads to the harbor of Broward County were flooded. As a result, there was a shortage of fuel in the county, and people could not run the emergency generators for pumping floodwater anymore. Eventually, fuel had to come from Tampa by truck, which is, however, more than 250 miles away. In 2016, NOAA granted Deltares, Broward County, and South Florida Water Management District the project Critical Infrastructure and Flood Resilience in South Florida as a pilot to explore the potential of CIFRe. The piloted development for Broward County aimed at obtaining a better understanding of when critical infrastructure fails during flood events, explore the interdependencies or cascading impacts and disruptions associated with this failure, and demonstrate CIFRe as a web tool for assessing any area. Sharing guidance on how to prepare and set up the CIFRe tool and use it in a participatory workshop is part of this webinar. Before moving on to the guidance, let us briefly reflect on a couple of recent flood events. Flood events cause fatalities and billions of economic damage. Hurricane Sandy in 2012 struck the northeast coast of the United States with 233 fatalities in total and a damage of over 68 billion. Last year, Hurricane Irma struck southeast Florida and the islands. In August, 52 direct fatalities were the result and 82 more indirect fatalities with a total damage estimated to be over $64 billion. Jennifer, can I ask you a question? Looking back at Hurricane Irma and the flood events in 2017, what was a major critical infrastructure disruption that affected the communities of Broward County?
Well, for us, Hurricane Irma, it was interesting in that for at least our county in Broward, we didn't have a lot of flooding, but we had a lot of damage resulting from down vegetation, down power lines. And this was an exceptional learning opportunity because as we had worked through the CIFRe tool in advance of Irma, we had felt as a community that we had fairly strong resilience of our electrical system, and we had a lot of redundancies because we have learned from previous storms, and many now operate with backup generators, and so we feel like we're pretty equipped to deal with certain degree of power failure. But we actually had a very severe incident that occurred in which we had some assisted living facilities, and one in particular where the power failure was such that there were not backup generators on hand, and it was an elder care facility, and in the absence of cooling, the residents began to suffer heat exhaustion, and we actually had a number of fatalities that occurred, and this was a facility that was actually fairly proximate to a hospital as well. So it really revealed the vulnerabilities of our vulnerable population, how we still have exposures in our community relating to electric failures, and it really underscored our own understanding of some of the weaknesses in our system.
Thank you for sharing these experiences, Jennifer. And it clearly underlines the cascading impacts that can occur. Then I now would like to give the webinar floor to Andreas to explore more about the Circle approach, the online Circle tool, and how to use it. Andreas, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Claire. And also from my side, a very warm welcome for this webinar. Claire already introduced me briefly. I would like to use this opportunity to introduce myself just in 2 sentences. As part of the flood risk management team of Deltares here in the Netherlands, I assess the impacts from natural hazards, for example, the economic losses, but also societal impacts. My focus is on the critical infrastructures and their role in natural disasters. I'm the co-developer of the Circle concept, which is a collaborative approach based on stakeholder engagement, on open data, and on comprehensive visualization techniques. The Circle concept was developed by Deltares together with our research partners in the last 5 years, and it was successfully applied in the CIFRe Project, but also in other case studies all around the world. The Circle concept is helping stakeholders to understand the complex relationships between critical infrastructures. Those relations or dependencies can be understood even without very detailed data about the infrastructure networks themselves. Instead, Circle is using stakeholders to share their experiences, their knowledge, and how certain infrastructure is critical for their operations. From this shared understanding, we can develop models and visualize the impacts from natural hazards, and together develop measures to make our society more resilient. In the next slides, I would like to show you how the Circle approach is used in the CIFRe project, and where we had 2 participatory Circle workshops. In the first workshop, we focused on a shared understanding of the critical infrastructures in Broward County. Before the workshop, we did a preliminary mapping of critical infrastructures, which we found through open data. Here we used OpenStreetMap and the county's open data portal. This mapping was reviewed and completed by the stakeholders during the first workshop. You can see a lot of post-its on the map on the left figure. Also, we presented a hazard scenario as a starting point for the discussion during the Circle session. In this case, we used a 22-inch rainfall scenario from USGS under an increased seawater level condition, which is projected for 2060. In the Circle session, the stakeholders discussed how they would be affected in such a scenario. The critical infrastructure operators explained their vulnerabilities. This is, for example, critical water depth, while the end users of the infrastructures explained their needs. In other words, how critical an infrastructure is for their operation. Based on the information we collected in the first workshop, we developed a comprehensive model of the critical infrastructures and cascading effects, which then can be applied to different hazard scenarios. In the second workshop, we reviewed the simulation, underlying assumptions, and cascading effects with all the stakeholders. Also, during the second workshop, the stakeholders together identified measures to increase the resilience of Broward County. So the overall approach is based on a participatory stakeholder engagement using the Circle tool, meaning that expert knowledge is gathered in a participatory manner about the vulnerabilities of the critical infrastructures, and also the objective is to identify the severity of cascading impacts. The stakeholders build their awareness and learn from each other about risk management measures and possible means for cooperation. Ultimately, this should result in cooperative mitigation strategies. Already in the beginning of the CIFRe project, we noticed the interest from many stakeholders to use the Circle concept on their own. So during the Understanding Risk Forum in 2018, biannual event organized by the World Bank, we launched CIRCle Online. You now can access CIRCle Online through the link which is shown on the slide and use it in your own workshops. CIRCle Online is optimized for touchscreens, but can also be used on large screens or a projector. In the next couple of slides, I would like to give you some guidance how you can use CIRCle for your own case study. Please don't forget to raise a question if something should be unclear from my explanations. So the most important elements for the CIRCle workshop are the following. A hazard scenario. This could be a recent event, the design event, or even an extreme scenario. I will come back on this aspect on the next slide. Secondly, maps, data or other information about critical infrastructures. I will explain more about maps and data in a minute. From the findings, you can prepare a first mapping of the infrastructures and end users in the area and a list of stakeholders which you would like to invite for the CIRCle workshop. This brings me to the third element, the stakeholders and the experts. So in the CIRCle session, we want to learn from each other what is critical. So it is critical that all stakeholders are present. We will explain later what we've learned in the CIFRe project. Then you need at least one moderator, better two, who are familiar with the CIRCle tool and can guide the discussion. As you can imagine, the discussion can sometimes get a little bit unstructured, so it is important to have a good moderator and keep the discussion plenary. Lastly, we advise also to have one designated note taker. Often, much more is discussed than we can enter in the CIRCle tool, such as experiences from recent events, operational rules, and so on. Nevertheless, this information is very important for building the model and for validation purposes, so it's very important to write them down as the discussion happens. I would like to add a few words on the hazard scenario. The overall goal of the CIRCle workshop is to understand the consequences of extreme natural events, even if they are unlikely to happen. The hazard scenario, however, can also be a design event or a recent event. What we've seen in the past is that it is essential to have a good hazard scenario to start a discussion about vulnerabilities and dependencies. You can see a map with the maximum water depth of the rainfall scenario, which may lead to, for example, outages of the electricity network. This then could be the starting point for the discussion during the workshop. With regard to available data, it is important to collect as much information as possible before the workshop. This could be GIS data, but also think of other sources of information such as field visits, interviews with stakeholders, news reports about recent events. In this way, you can already establish contact with the experts in your area and make sure they understand the need to participate at a CIRCle workshop itself and their role in the process. In the next slides, I would like to guide you through the different steps of the CIRCle session and the CIRCle tool itself. So a typical CIRCle workshop consists of 5 steps. Create a session and identify critical infrastructures. Review and select critical infrastructures. Identify direct and indirect impacts. Validate those impacts and relationships and classify them. I will now explain you how you come to those steps. The end result of a CIRCle workshop could look like the circle you've seen on the right-hand side. After you have created your account for the CIRCle tool, which is free of charge if I haven't mentioned this yet, you can create a new CIRCle session through the link in the top bar, Create Session. For each session, you need to add some information about the session, such as the title, the language, currency, units, area, type of hazard, and the year of the scenario. The title is important, so you can find back your sessions in the session list under My Sessions. CIRCle Online currently supports 10 different languages: English, Dutch, German, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, Greek, Indonesian, and Italian. The reason we've added so many languages is that the discussion between the stakeholders should always take place in the mother language. In our team, we can cover most of the languages, but we've also used interpreters in the past if the workshop if the language we did the workshop in, we were not fluent in. For the unit, Circle supports both meters and feet, which was essential for our case studies in the US. The type of hazard, you can currently choose from 7 different types of flooding. The reason we distinguish here is that the vulnerabilities and impacts may differ depending on the type of flooding. So if you want to have one session focusing on a rainfall scenario and another on the impacts from coastal flooding in the same area, you can specify it here. Then I already mentioned the mapping as part of the workshop preparation. The collection and review of the critical infrastructure is a very important step in our Circle workshops, as it not only shows if we have, for example, missed data, but also recent developments in the area and so on. You can see a map here with a maximum. We also make sure that all stakeholders are familiar with the area, and we often see the discussion already starting on the map. Next, in the Circle tool, you can select the critical infrastructures which are identified in the area and thus needed to be present in the Circle. This can be done by selecting either the overall category, say for example, water, or the subcategories, different components, water-specific component, such as drinking water pumps. In the Circle Online tool, you can select a maximum of 15 categories. We've seen in the past that this should be the maximum number of infrastructures in the Circle, as it is otherwise difficult to structure the discussion and channel the information. So sometimes it is necessary to group infrastructure, while in other cases it's better to distinguish between individual subcategories. After you have finished your selection, you can review all information and click on Create Session, which brings you to the Circle tool. Now you can see the Circle for 5 categories: water, telecommunication, transportation, electricity, and industries, just as an example. In the first step, the stakeholders are going to discuss how their infrastructure can be impacted by the hazard directly. Direct impact here refers to the physical or structural impact caused by the disaster, such as the destruction of an infrastructure caused by a flood event. So for example, the representative from the electricity utility will tell you that electricity will be shut down for safety reasons as soon as the area is flooded with more than 30 centimeters of water, 1 feet. This information can be added to the Circle by clicking the Direct button. This will bring you to a dialog box where you can specify the threshold and add a description. If information about the direct impact was added to the Circle, the category field is shown filled. So here you can see that we've added the information for electricity. Next, all stakeholders discuss how they would be affected by an electricity outage. This we call the indirect impact or relation, referring to the physical or structural impact caused by the failure or destruction of another infrastructure. So for example, if the electricity is out, then the drinking water pumps cannot be operated anymore. This information can be added through the Indirect button, where you can specify the following aspects. Description, this is a free text field. Delay, maybe there is a backup for a certain period. Recovery time, how long will it take to continue with the normal operations? And costs, for example, what is the economic impact of an outage? Now you can see the dialog box. It's important to note that you don't have to fill all the fields, but on the same moment, it's important to get as much information as possible from the stakeholders. Already during the discussion, you can validate the information using, for example, recent events you have found during the preparation phase of the workshop. You could ask the the stakeholders how they reacted in this situation, what they have experienced, what they have learned, for example, during the last hurricane. This step is very valuable as it will show the actions before, during, and after the event and most likely the interaction between different stakeholders. We've seen that we can learn so much from recent events, why certain things happen or not happen, and how they affected the society. Could also use an extreme scenario to see if your assumptions are still valid. You can now see the final circle, as we discussed during the first workshop in the CIFRe project. We've discussed a lot of dependencies and added them in the tool. You can see that the importance of electricity and the road network, but also the harbor as a critical facility based on the experiences and the information from the stakeholders. In the very last step of the circle workshop, we will walk through all relations, check if we have captured the information correctly, and assign an impact category to the relation. The impact category ranges from low, no importance, to high, very high importance, and makes it possible to express the criticality of certain relations. As an example, you can see here that for the hospital, both electricity and road network are classified as red, very high, so both are absolutely critical for the operations. Before I conclude my presentation, I would like to give a number of tips on the workshop design. What I told before, good preparation is essential. It is very important to make use of your networks, of the stakeholders in your area, and already engage them before the workshop to be part of the process. Secondly, collect as much information as possible. Also try to find out about recent experiences, activities which are currently going on, but also future plannings, extensions of the city, and so on. We advise to have an optimal group size between 20 and 30 participants. It is important that all participants have enough time for discussion and exchange, also during the breaks, and that the discussion is not too unstructured. And lastly, the circle session is just one element of the overall workshop. So what I've shown now should be embedded in other elements. For example, the identification of measures. We use the bow tie technique and also other techniques to interact with the stakeholders. This concludes my part of the presentation. I hope I was able to give guidance how to set up and conduct a circle workshop and how to use the circle tool. In the last slide, I would like to show a visualization we developed in our 3D visualization engine for Broward County in the course of this project. You can see the impact of the 22-inch flood scenario and a number of cascading effects in the area, all based on the information from the circle workshop. This visualization was the starting point for the second workshop, where we identified measures how to make this area more resilient in the future.
Thank you for your explanations, Andreas. We got two questions for you, and one that I would like to ask you is, data is not always readily available. Could you give an example of this and how you handled it in the past?
Actually, we set up Circle because of the fact that data about critical infrastructure is not available most of the times. So working in data scarce environment, working with assumptions and getting information from the stakeholders instead of getting access to the detailed network data was the starting point for Circle. We have learned in the past from the stakeholders how they react in certain situations, how they operate a network.
Well, let's move on. I would like to give Jennifer the webinar floor to explain more about how the results of the CIFRe project can help support the policy and implementation of adaptation efforts in Broward County. Jennifer, please go ahead.
But I'll just talk a little bit now about some of the resiliency work here in Broward County and how the Circle tool has really come into play at a critical part in time in our policy planning process. Prior to being introduced to CIRCLE, Broward County had made sizable investments in working to advance resiliency planning for our communities. And we, like many, commenced with some of the basic tools, which include our comprehensive plan and really trying to integrate climate considerations as part of, first of all, a separate climate element within our comprehensive plan. And then we worked, like many, to integrate climate and resiliency considerations into topical areas such as water resources planning or emergency management, various areas of conservation activities and infrastructure considerations. But then we began to delve into issues of land use. So it's one thing to say that we have, general overarching policies that guide the way that we operate in a community, but we, like many, were being confronted with questions about future land use and the vulnerabilities of areas that might be targeted for redevelopment. So we began looking at future flood risk and identifying what we called priority planning areas, which would be areas at risk of increased inundation with rising seas. But still, this wasn't a complete picture for us. And we, while we began to move forward with these preliminary steps, we also began working with very complex hydrologic models to take a more integrated assessment or have a more complete understanding of the types of exposures that occur as we deal with the combined impacts of rising seas, rising groundwater table, and increased rainfall, and the confluence of these issues as it relates to future flood risk. This was simply one area of exploration. Clearly, there are many other things that we need to consider, such as storm surge, but in the event, in the long run and more immediate, our community was most able to really appreciate some of the exposures that we have when we look at flood risk in the combined impacts that I just expressed. We're at a point where we're working to translate these tools to a regulatory environment. So it's one thing to be able to present a hydrograph or to be able to present a frequency of inundation, but it's another to be able to really think about spatially, how does that relate to your community, and how do you need to begin to organize infrastructure requirements? We had a really difficult time translating a lot of what we knew from the modeled environment to the types of visualizations and communications that can support the tough decision making that we have. And that might be in the area of, say, budget planning. It could be in the way of design standards or some of the engineering requirements that we might begin to talk about, and uniform standards for a community. So what we've lacked in part of this process has been a coordinated means or method for presenting the diversity of infrastructure-related issues that we have for the future. So it's not just simply where we put infrastructure, but how we design it, and understanding much more completely the interrelationship between exposures in one sector and as it might cascade to another. And certainly flood risk presents that type of challenge. As Claire indicated, we've had experiences from the port where fuel disruptions presented the operation of generators. We've had other airport disruptions that occur with flooding on runways, and there's a great interplay between what happens at our port and at our airport, and then how that translates to a whole broader realm of issues relating to economic activity and tourism. And so the CIRCLE tool itself allows us to explore those things more completely. And so it's one about the relationships and utilizing the exposures and experience of individuals that work in each of these sectors to really help us better understand the nature of those relationships as well as the severity. And then it's another to bring it back to the modeled environment. So for us, being able to take the CIRCLE results, and as Andreas just shared, bringing it back to a modeled environment where we can see that spatial interplay has been just immensely impactful in working with our community. So the next slide, please. And so as an example of kind of this process of evolution, I'm trying to see if we move to the next slide. There may be a delay. There we are. So part of this process of evolution, it's represented in these slides as we move from our initially what would be our priority planning area map. So it delineates these areas of exposure just based upon sea level rise. That's the figure on the left. It doesn't take into account any of the interconnected hydrologic considerations that we have. So as we were dealing with this kind of static presentation of risk, we were working on more of a dynamic system in our work with the USGS and being able to look at downscaled climate impacts and the management of our water management system, and how flood risk in one area is really contingent upon the operations of a much more complete network of infrastructure, canals, and controls. And so then we move into the top right figure, which is this modeled environment of how flood risk evolves. So in this case, we were not only able to look just at the increase in severity of rainfall, but this was modeled on top of the change in groundwater table. So we were able to look at how much more severe flood risk becomes when you lose storage in the soils, when you have less ability to discharge downstream because water levels in the coastal area are higher. And so you see flood risk expand spatially in a way that we are certainly not accustomed. And then we took the results of that circle tool where we began to look at, well, how is your telecommunications infrastructure and your wastewater infrastructure and your water supply infrastructure and your roads and other highways connected, so that where you have one particular exposure that seems kind of acute and perhaps even isolated begins to have much more broader impacts than what you would anticipate just upon say a very narrow vulnerability assessment. And this allows us to look at not only the spikes that emerge from a hub, but the severity as was shared. So now we can look at prioritizing resilience methods and investments based upon the complexity really of those systems. So while we were working with the stakeholder community in the circle environment, we were also working with many other stakeholders in our community with whom we've engaged for several decades, including a technical advisory committee that supports our Water Advisory Board and the Water Advisory Board itself, which reports to the Broward County Board of County Commissioners. Additionally, we held a resiliency workshop with the leadership across our complete county, which includes 31 cities and the business community, to really start to bring together this visualization of how future flood risk translates across our entire community. And it's not just the coastal environments, but also many of our western communities. And it was in the course of having these conversations and looking at these future risk flood maps that our community said, we shouldn't be making an investment decision of any kind that isn't viewed within this type of environment, where we're able to see the broader ramifications of decision making as it relates to our infrastructure, our ability to support those those developments themselves, the robustness of the systems that provide those interconnections. And so it's been a very powerful conversation piece as we look at how we think about land use, development requirements, the exposures of our transportation systems, some of the weaknesses and needs within managing a regional network that provides flood control for individual and connected communities, and then thinking about discrete infrastructure such as, again, telecommunications, or it could be a transformer or some piece of infrastructure that's part of this broader network. The next slide, please. And so as a result of a lot of the work that's taken place and our ability to finally move from what is a modeled environment to one that's much more visually compelling and able to express to the broader group of individuals that really need to be involved with resiliency planning and investments, we're now moving to a new application in which we're building out our entire hydrologic model for the county. This initial work focused on two targeted areas where we did refined modeling with narrow time steps that allowed us to look at this flood evolution, but we don't have that kind of powerful tool available yet for our entire community. this work demonstrated the value of being able to look at flooding at a much more refined level, and the need for assessing the vulnerability of our infrastructure in this type of with this type of tool. So today we are working on a number of things. We are working to update our county flood model under future flood conditions. We're building out the detail and time steps on our regional hydrologic models, and we are preparing to undertake a much more complete analysis of infrastructure on a county-wide basis, informed by the type of cascading impacts that we're able to integrate in the CIRCLE tool. And we expect that that work in the next 2 to 3 years will serve as the foundation for a coordinated infrastructure improvement plan focused on resilience and as I said, our infrastructure looking at future flood risk. We'll be tying into that economics, because we've learned that it's important to be able to demonstrate the return on investment as part of our communications when we're looking at large-scale organization of funding. And these types of tools will help us communicate, as I said, better with the business community, with the public at large, and with those that are ultimately going to be responsible for helping to organize the resources for the types of investments that we need long-term. So with that, I think I have concluded my slides and transition to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer, for explaining how CIRCLE and the project helped you getting the critical infrastructure vulnerabilities addressed and picked up in the adaptation and resiliency planning efforts of Broward County. Then I would like to move on to the next topic of further developments. Obi, can I ask you a question? What would be the critical development aspects for using the CIRCLE approach in emergency management and resiliency planning?
Yes, thank you, Claire. Let me add something to the introduction that Claire made about me. And prior to this position at the Florida International University in Miami in academia, I was the co-principal investigator for South Florida Water Management District, which is one of the partners in this project funded by NOAA. We realized the importance of identifying cascading impacts of the regional flooding or local flooding on critical infrastructure early on. But after I moved to this new position, I realized there are a lot of benefits of using this tool in two areas, and that would require further development. One is the resiliency planning. For example, you want to look at what are the what is the quantification of impacts or cascading impacts of a particular shock or hazard, and incorporate those quantifications into planning, not only for current situation, but also for future. Let's say you want to look at what is the impact of sea level rise in 2050 or 2060, or flooding resulting from increased rainfall. So if you have a tool like the one that Broward County had for modeling, you could use this tool to identify the effects of flooding in that case for future condition. But more importantly, those linkages could be populated with more data on costs and benefits. And then we can combine all these sectors or critical infrastructure components into an overall planning or optimization system that could be used for planning future adaptation options. So I see that this CIRCLE tool not only gives decision makers and the public and the professionals working in resiliency planning a way to visualize, but also a tool that could be used for more detailed quantification of cascading impacts. So I see there is a big potential for that. And I think one of the things that we are looking at is, can we quantify the effect of flooding, not only on buildings, but also on transportation or utility system or energy systems, and then combine that using what we call a system of systems approach to do that. And I think that's one of the developments that that we should be looking at. The other area that I think this circle will be very beneficial is in emergency management. You don't have a lot of time to look at the cascading impacts during a particular event. And by doing this work up front using circle, you can immediately identify, given a particular hazard, what areas or what critical infrastructure would be impacted. And that could be very useful for those managing an emergency, whether it's an emergency operations center or support staff, or communicate that to decision makers and the public. These are the infrastructure, critical infrastructure components that would be affected, and even quantify them. And finally, we could also use this tool for training emergency staff for emergency planning by playing some games, if I can call it that, to demonstrate in a future hazard situation what areas would be impacted quickly or would have some delayed impacts in some cases. And that could be very useful for those who are involved in emergency management planning process. Next slide, please. So we've been talking about flooding as what I call a shock or hazard. But this particular tool can be used for many other hazards or shocks. It could be useful for earthquake situation or cyclones, or water scarcity like a drought situation or extreme heat situation. And also you can apply the tool for various scales. It doesn't have to be a regional scale, it could be a localized scale. And depending on which critical infrastructure you're interested in, the tool could be very useful for identifying cross-sector, cross-component impacts and quantify them. But more importantly, another area of development is when you have multiple hazards at the same time. For example, you have a storm surge and sea level rise on the coast, and you have heavy rainfall event. And if you all are familiar with what's happening in North Carolina these days due to Hurricane Florence, you see you see what we call compound flooding impacts, storm surge and river flooding, which can have impacts a week or 2 weeks later, or even in the Philippines, you have that superstorm. So I think this is a very useful tool that we can develop into looking at multiple hazards in the future. I think that concludes my part of the further development aspects. I'll hand it over to Claire now, or Andreas.
Yeah. Thank you, Obi, for explaining your view on the further developments of the Circle tool. I think it's now time to start the open discussion. In the meantime, we did get some questions, and one of the previous questions may have not been understood completely by everybody because of an issue with the sound. But let me first move to Andreas. Andreas, can the tool be used for multi-hazards? In Vancouver, we would like to look at 8 earthquakes, risk, and flooding together and individually. Obi just explained that these are further developments that we envisage. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what kind of timeline and what priorities might be envisaged for this further development?
Yeah, thank you, Claire. This is an excellent question. Thanks a lot for bringing this in. We have used Circle for other hazards than flooding in the past already. For example, we did workshop in Istanbul, or extensive study in Istanbul, where flooding is one of the issues from heavy rainfall, but earthquakes definitely the most the biggest risk they currently have. I have to say that the Circle Online, when we put it online, we decided to focus on flood-related issues. So with the Circle Online tool, you can only do flooding as everything is prepared for this. But the general approach is applicable to all the different hazards. We are working on a multi-hazard version of the Circle tool, where you then in the dialog boxes also can use the units which are typical for another hazard, let's say for the earthquake, the peak ground acceleration. You can then enter this type of information instead of only the flood threshold, flood depth threshold. I'm not very sure about the timeline, what we can achieve, because it's ongoing development. We look for project for this, but we definitely have the ambition to extend Circle Online. And if you would like to use it in an earlier stage or would like to become a beta tester for what we already did, then I would say get in touch with us and let's see what is possible.
Okay, thank you, Andreas. Jennifer, I also got another question from the participants regarding the number of participants and stakeholders that we invited for the first and the second workshop. Could you reflect a little bit upon that?
Sure. We actually went through a bit of a stepwise process. I can hear some feedback there. We commenced with the first workshop very targeted. We thought specifically, who are the individuals that have the data that we're after? And that was, I think, a little bit smaller of a group, between maybe 35 and 40. I think we made the planning team a little bit nervous because we were starting to edge up beyond what they thought would be a manageable initial discussion. I also saw the question in here that was raised, Claire, I hope you don't mind my saying, but there was a question about the data security issues. And this was something that we struggled with in the workshop too, because we had to kind of reframe what would be our target or our expectations for some of the data in that process because of security issues. But as I indicated, initially we were really focused on who had the data available. After we went through that first workshop, the next workshop, we branched out further. And I should say too that the first workshop was really focused on the immediate stakeholders who lived in and worked in the area where the model, we had the refined application. It was not originally a regional discussion, but it became very evident as we were dealing with a number of kind of characteristic flood events in the course of our tool development and its application, not only Hurricane Irma, but we had another massive storm event that resulted in a major shutdown of a prominent commercial establishment, resulting in tens of millions of dollars in economic loss in just a couple of days. And so that was yet another kind of learning experience. And so with the next workshop, we broadened quite a bit further to include stakeholders from all of our cities that could build upon these recent experiences and help better inform the process. And then our final workshop was even reaching out beyond Broward County. But I would say that the initial workshop, focusing on about 35 individuals, was I think a good size. The next workshop was more on the order of 50. And then subsequently, we were working with webinars and so forth to communicate even more broadly. But 50 was probably the threshold for being able to manage productive work discussions. And even then we had 4 or 5 different breakout groups, and each of those had to be staffed appropriately. So you had to, really take into account how much in the way of support staff did we have to organize each of the breakout conversations.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yes, that was really big help to have all the support staff jumping in the project too during our final workshop, where we really hit the number of 50, which is exciting, but also challenging if you want to work in breakouts. Related to this question a bit is a question for Andreas. What is the optimal scale of the tool? Do you need to use it regionally, or can you also use it on a neighborhood scale?
Oh, good point. We have used the approach on different scales. I think it's strongly related to the question or the goal of the use of the tool. So the smallest scale we ever used was for an industrial area I believe 250 companies. So it's really, really small scale and very, very detailed data. And the biggest one, I believe, was for an entire province, comparable to Broward County, because there all the processes and all the initiatives, they happened on a county scale. I think Circle can be used on all levels, but the smaller the scale, the better the data needs to be. If you look on a neighborhood, we need very detailed data about how the neighborhood functions and a good or excellent flood model, for example, hazard model. While if we look on a county scale, then we can do certain assumptions. We usually assume that an entire neighborhood is out of electricity if it's flooded. So then, yeah, I think that's really depending on what type of data is available and also what type of stakeholders would like to participate. Yeah.
Okay, and then Jennifer also mentioned it briefly, the confidentiality of information. How have you addressed concerns about security and confidentiality, and also where is the server based for Circle? That's another question.
Yeah, the first one on the confidentiality of data. Not having access to the data was one of the starting points why we decided to ask the stakeholders about their experiences, their operational rules, how they about responsibilities during an event, because we could not get access to the data. We wanted to build a complex model and we could not get the data of the stakeholders. Even if we would have received it, it's usually in a format we cannot work with, or in a software we do not use or we don't have access to. There are still concerns about confidential data, about information which is shared. So we always agree with the participants in the workshop, during the workshop, that all information they share remains in the workshop if they wish so. And we also had it that people say, well, I cannot share this information, but let me explain from, let's say, from this recent outage, how we reacted on this. So we try to work with the confidential data or with confidential information. It's a trusted environment, and we don't share data to the outside world if it's not wished.
Okay, thank you. And another question, I guess also for you, Andreas, is whether we have done any studies in the Asia Pacific and what type of data sets you would need to use the Circle model. So there's two questions, basically.
Yeah, I think the type of data sets does not change depending on the region. You need a good hazard model, you need good data about the critical infrastructure you would like to look at. So that's usually the utilities responsible for serving a city, an area. And you need the stakeholders to be interviewed to share during the workshop. We have run a study in Yangon in Myanmar on the effects of multiple hazards on their drinking water network. So it was one utility only, but a group of, I believe, 5 or 7 different types of hazards, because the city would like to make their drinking water network more reliable and ensuring the quality. They had an outage for, I believe it was more than 2 weeks after an earthquake, because several pipes were broken and they could not recover fast enough. And this, of course, has a big impact on the society. Well, Istanbul, we did a workshop on the Asian side of Istanbul, if this counts, and the Circle was presented in a number of Chinese case studies, but we haven't run a Circle workshop yet.
Okay, thank you. Obi, this may be a question that you can explain a little bit more, or Jennifer. What kind of flooding model is currently used for Broward County and South Florida?
I'll answer in general, and maybe Jennifer could, add to it.
Yeah.
So the model that you need depends on your area and the resolution you need to identify those impacts of hazards. In case of Broward County, I believe that was a locally developed model through the efforts of U.S. Geological Survey. In this region of South Florida in the United States, the surface water groundwater interaction is very strong, so you need to account for both aspects in modeling to simulate flooding. So they use a fairly sophisticated model. And right now, I think that, as Jennifer explained, it's going to be expanded for the entire county, and they're going to use, I believe, Mike 11. But it doesn't matter which model you use, as long as it can accurately reflect, in this case, the flooding, the depth and the duration, and the extent. I think it doesn't matter. You could use, in the United States, what we call a river analysis system, or RAS. So it doesn't matter, but the model has to be, reflect the type of conditions that you can expect during a hazard at the spatial temporal scale that you need.
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense. Have you anything to add to this, Jennifer?
I could just note that they work with USGS. I'm sorry, there's a lot of feedback on this phone. The work with the USGS did involve the use of ModFlow for the groundwater component, and then they developed a separate urban runoff package to deal with the issues with the the soil and surface interface. A lot of this work was intended to kind of test the functionality of the urban runoff package in representing some of the characteristics of our environment. We do also, though, use Mike 11 for our development of a regional flood map. And I believe that our base model has had a grid cell of something, the 500 feet, and I think we're scaling that down now to maybe 250 or something even less. So it really has been, what we focused on is the ability to address that interface as a key component. The resolution of the grid was 500 meters being the minimum size, and we continue to refine that. And then the time step being the next issue. And so we've been, narrowing from the daily down to the hourly time steps for our work. And it just depends on the type of question that we're asking, which of our models that we've employed, but each of those reflects, nearly 10 years of development. We're constantly working to improve them for the applications that are the challenging questions that we need in order to inform infrastructure planning.
Yes, thank you, Jennifer. So basically, all the main sources that are important for flooding predictions in Broward County are included in the model, but further developments and improvements are going on.
Right.
Thanks. Then there's a couple of other questions. Andreas, there's a question about whether the visualization tool for the inundation is free, like the circle tool.
Now, the visualization you have seen for Broward County 3D visualization is not part of the functionality of the Circle Online. This is something we do for the projects if it's a bigger project and if there is room to do so. But currently, the output of the Circle Online is a report summarizing the findings from the Circle workshop, and the process you start with having the workshop.
Yeah, thank you. So there's usually some post-processing. Once you have done the Circle workshop, you get a lot of valuable information, but you make it tangible in these kind of visualizations. That requires another couple of steps.
Right, and we for this project we had opportunity to develop this 3D visualization engine and serious gaming engine. So there we can also play with the infrastructure, where we can explore different hazard scenarios and see how the system reacts. But this is only for, this is not part of the Circle Online.
Okay, Thank you. And then there's another question for you about the circle visual. Do the colors indicate the priorities of each section of the circle, or is it the size of each element of the circle, which indicates the priorities?
Yeah, so the colors in the standard view, they help to see the line from which sector to which sector the relationship is built. The width of the sector, it gives an indication on how many relations there actually are. So you usually see that there are a lot of relations to from electricity to other services, or from road to other services sectors. I think that the priority is defined by the criticality classification. So that was the last step I presented, where the stakeholders show how critical a certain relation is. And you can have, let's say, 10 different relations from one infrastructure to others, but they all may be from low importance. While for the hospital, we've seen there were 3 relations, and they were all very critical to the operations of the hospital, but it's 3 different sectors only.
Okay, thank you. Then there's another 2 questions on using the tool. One is if I'm able to develop a model for the region, who should I approach for the best use? Nationally, locally, how can I do my modeling or make good use of it?
Well, this is well, obviously it's Jennifer.
Yeah, go ahead.
It seems to me that most communities, I guess I'll provide a couple of responses. A lot of in a community such as ours, where we've had historical development of models on a regional scale, I think that we've continued to try to optimize those existing investments because they've been so sizable. But a lot of the communities are working on modeling at a more refined level, utilizing the boundary conditions of a larger model, for example. And it seems to me that most are going to be putting out RFPs, requests for proposals for different types of tools. It seems to me that most communities are working through model development through that type of process. So it would be, in my mind, keeping an eye. It depends on who you're trying to solicit. Of course, there's federal funding to do, applied model development, and many of those communities might be looking for partners. Maybe there are academic partners. So, reaching out to somebody who may be working in that field, who's connected with local communities, if there's a suitable model that could be useful in helping to resolve some of these challenges, particularly where communities have not made those investments in the past. It would seem to me that working with an academic partner to have an applied application and demonstration might be a good approach. Those would be the 2 things I'd offer.
Yep. Thank you. And related to the modeling, Andreas, there's a rather technical question. What file types can be exported from the Circle tool, or what is Circle exporting in general?
So the output from Circle Online is currently a workshop report. But I believe that input for further modeling, and also for example, for our game engine, we then transfer the information into an Excel document and combine for example, the critical thresholds with the GIS data, the GIS layer, and the hazard layers, and then use a relationship database, transfer all the data, all the relationships which were established in the Circle to a relationship database, and also use this for the game engine. The standard output is a report document.
Okay, and then slightly related question. If you want to assess measures of flood resilience with the tool, how can that be done?
In the last workshop, and at the second workshop for the CIFRe project, we used the bow tie method, looking into possible causes and consequences of failure of a critical infrastructure. And then as the second step of the bow tie approach, looking like how could we avoid those interruptions? What are the possibilities? In general, you have two strategies. You can either prevent the infrastructure from failing, so for example, increasing a transformer above flood level, or making a flood wall around your critical infrastructure. But also you can think about measures which reduce the criticality, like redundancy, having backup for a certain period of time. Either that infrastructure is not failing, or that the consequences of this failing infrastructure are not becoming critical. We see, for example, backup generators at flood pumps or at your hospital, so that they can continue their operations for a number of days.
And how would you be able to evaluate the effectiveness of these kind of measures?
I think the stakeholders will, when they think about measures and when they think about the how critical certain infrastructure for their operations is, you will see immediate response in the discussion, like, does it work for me? Is this practical? Especially in the road sector, we see that often we are asked to increase the height of a road, but in the same moment we hear then from the authorities that they just completely renewed the road, so this is not an option for the next 10 to 20 years. And the stakeholders will discuss this.
Yes, and that's always a valuable discussion. And does the circle simulation, like you showed in the movie, also offer an opportunity to explore the effect of measures?
In our serious gaming engine, we have now the possibility to play with critical infrastructure. So we could, for example, increase the threshold of the infrastructure or increase the infrastructure itself in a playful way. We also can look at different hazard scenarios, but that's currently ongoing development. We hope that also in the future we can add or edit the infrastructure itself. So for example, add redundancy or link a critical facility to a certain element of the critical infrastructure, but that's ongoing development at the moment.
Claire, can I add to that?
Yeah, sure. Go
that
ahead.
Question on the in terms of resiliency planning. So think of a situation now, you have a circle that you have developed, and particularly if you populate those links with some impacts of particular cascading effects, and then that would identify the areas of critical importance, you know, those, I think Andreas mentioned red, yellow, and green. And then based on that, you could, let's say, I'm going to develop some adaptation actions for those areas to improve the emergency situation or any other impact in the system itself. And then you come up with a new circle. To me, that would be very useful to demonstrate to people who are making decisions or to the public. If you do this improvement in this particular component, this is what the circle would look like. And you can go one step further with further development. You can overall quantify overall economic value of the benefit you get versus the cost that you might incur by improving the system, not only for the present, but also for some future condition, let's say 30, 40 years from now. So that circle tool becomes the central tool, not only to communicate your options, but also perhaps come up with some quantification of the benefits and costs as we discussed.
Yep, thank you. Thank you, Obi. Jennifer, how could we include citizen needs more in the adaptation planning? Do you have an idea or suggestions for that?
Well, I think that that's an interesting point because I believe that when we commenced the process, I think that we didn't sufficiently develop areas relating to citizens as well as hospitality. Those were two areas. Obviously, one, hospitality from economic standpoint, but citizens, there's so many needs and unanticipated impacts, and ultimately the recovery of a community is dependent upon the citizens' ability to be kind of buffered from impacts through resiliency measures, or quickly able to recover in order to help other elements of the community accelerate through the recovery process. And we know the duration of that recovery process is going to dictate the severity of economic, the broader economic implications. So there's a dramatic need, of course, to address that better. We spend a lot of time in stakeholder engagement. Clearly, when we went through this process, though, we were focused on a type of stakeholder. There's no reason why you couldn't, after going through an exercise like this, and I think it's useful to get it started because of the data kind of foundation that we had here working, with some of the practitioners. But coming back to the community and trying to use those anecdotal stories or those personal experiences to kind of test our assumptions, I think is a really wise and informative component to an exercise like this, because I think that we do make assumptions about maybe the resilience of individual communities or citizenry, and oftentimes we don't have the full picture. So I think that the storytelling is one of the most impactful ways to develop a more complete understanding of how events really do play out in a community. And I think that citizens feel incredibly empowered and connected when those stories end up helping to inform our overall knowledge of priorities. So, and they can helping to really prioritize those exposures, because we go through this process of ranking or rating the severity, and somebody might say that's a really maybe not a severe issue if you have all these other resources available to you. But if you don't have all of those resources available to you, how does it alter the way that you view the severity of that impact? And of course, we learned that with the energy disruption. Perhaps energy isn't considered all that critical if you've got these redundancies in place and you only need to survive for 3 days. But what happens when you don't have those redundancies and the 3 days is now 7? Or when we looked at issues of fuel disruption, where we had a lot of discussion about there's not a fuel shortage. There's not a fuel shortage. All the tankers are available. They're right offshore. Yeah, they're right offshore. They can't get into the ports. They can't distribute the fuel. And you had 2 weeks of no access to fuel, essentially, unless you were in line for fuel at 3 o'clock in the morning. And it took 2 weeks to have that void refilled again. It took that long to see the distribution network recovered. And so, it is very different when you live an experience and it causes you to rethink, what does resiliency really mean, and how do you address that, and what types of investments ultimately are, because it's not just about, it's not just about the ports, it's not just about the roads, there's all these other facets. And so I think you could either start the process with the community, or you could bring a partially informed work product to them, which I think, could be very attractive. So where are the weaknesses in here? But I hope I've responded to it. There's just so many ways to approach it, but the citizen component, I think, is necessary for really testing what we've developed in the way of, a more practitioner sort of setting.
Thank you, Jennifer. These are difficult things to consider in adaptation planning, and I'm glad to hear your views and how Broward would like to proceed with that. I think we have addressed basically most of the questions. Time is moving on, so I would like to proceed with wrapping up this webinar and give a few closing remarks and also how we will share the information presented during this webinar. So next slide, please. After today's webinar, You will be able to start using Circle by yourself for your own area of interest. The Circle approach supports us in engaging stakeholders actively and helps to refine the adaptation and resiliency planning to include critical infrastructure as a vital component to that. We also have some further developments planned, basically by extending the current Circle approach to include more multi-shocks and stressors in identifying cascading impacts and extending the use of the tool towards emergency management. Next slide, please. Jennifer, Obi, and Andreas, I would like to thank you for presenting Circle Online and sharing your experiences and advices today. On behalf of the whole CIFRe team, I would like to thank you all for actively participating in this webinar. We hope you enjoyed the webinar. The results of this webinar will become available as a recording soon at the Deltares Academy website, and also at the project website, which will be coming up soon too. You can access the Circle Online tool at circledeltares.org, and you can contact us for additional information at circle@deltares.nl or academy@deltares.nl, and you will also be able to contact us personally where needed. Thank you so much for participating, and we hope to see you soon.